A plane is down. Passengers are dead. In the aftermath, the pilots are blamed. But is that fair?
It should never have happened. The plane should have been tested in the first place.
A 3-month-old engine blew up.
Amsterdam last autumn. The world's worst airport disaster when a jumbo jet crashed onto a block of flats. And the start of a Cook Report investigation into air safety. On site with us, another pilot who'd also fought to control an airliner doomed to crash. Another nasty air disaster and blames being apportioned almost instantly.
Yes, I think that there is a continuing trend following aviation disasters such as this, even though there has been a catastrophic mechanical failure, to attribute the blame solely to pilot error.
David McClelland was the co-pilot of the Kegworth Boeing 737, which suffered catastrophic engine failure.
The twin images of disaster and shock, so firmly etched in the mind of the nation after Lockerbie, returned last night like a recurring nightmare.
And for the pilots, another nightmare began.
Pilot shut off the wrong engine.
The pilots did shut down an undamaged engine, but as we show, that wasn't the prime cause of the accident. At Amsterdam Airport, the crew were immediately blamed too.
El Al pilot ignored controller's advice.
I personally feel that the pilots are the soft options. As in this particular case, they did not survive the crash. If they are fortunate enough to survive the crash, then they can be sacked.
He was sacked and successfully sued his employers, British Midland, for unfair dismissal. Stephen McCoy, now 21, survived Kegworth, but it's left him permanently brain damaged. For victims like him, a deal has now been done with British Midland, Boeing and the engine makers. Compensation will be paid, but without those responsible for the plane having to admit liability for the accident. Meanwhile, outside the courts, the industry has chosen to blame the pilots.
If pilot error was anywhere near as widespread as people would have us believe, we could solve all those accidents by simply putting a placard on the dash panel that says, "You're prohibited from crashing this airplane. You're prohibited from making mistakes." But that doesn't work because we've got fallible human beings. And with the Kegworth crash, just as with many others, it's because we have a chain of human error caused by other errors and problems that we had an accident, not because you had pilots just fouling up.
David McClelland is now taking further legal action to clear his name so that he can fly again. We've now established that the independent air accident report was altered after being sent to the industry for comment. Just before publication, a new paragraph was added to the final page. This said the pilots acted contrary to their training and effectively blamed them for the accident. In the immediate aftermath of that accident, relatives and survivors attend a simple memorial service. Ironically, those who suffered most don't blame the pilots. Back at Amsterdam, memories of a different kind.
It brings in to me the feelings that I had within the cockpit, as the recollections of the events afterwards are very, very hazy. But the pressures that the crew must have been operating under, it is so simple for the officials, the investigators, to sit on the ground behind their desks, criticising, suggesting, as in this incident, the captain should have taken another airfield. The captain should have selected another runway. Easy with hindsight, easy in the comfort of your chair to do that. The pressures of the cockpit, the pressures that you're under in such a life or death situation make it much more difficult. And that comes flooding back to me, my own recollection and feeling of that situation.
In Vienna, a widow remembers her husband. Joseph Turner was the co-pilot of a Boeing 767 which crashed in Thailand, killing all 223 people on board. In his wife's own words, she went crazy when immediate speculation blamed the crew.
I flew to Bangkok. I want to see everything with my own eyes. Yeah, it was a misery from the beginning to the end. I tried to find something which belongs to him, and yeah, it was terrible what I saw there.
Although events were to prove her husband blameless, in their grief, some relatives blamed him.
I can't describe this feeling. I felt I must kill everybody who says that. It nearly makes me crazy, because the silliness and the misunderstanding of the people, and they don't think, just blame dead people. It's okay.
Even Niki Lauda, the airline's boss and former world champion racing driver, initially agreed it was pilot error. The engine, by mistake, had gone into reverse in mid-air, and the industry said the pilot should still have been able to control the plane.
Niki Lauda went to Gatwick and flew the simulator, then gave a press conference and said, in effect, I can't understand why the crew couldn't have recovered it. I was able so to do. He's in a simulator that's been programmed for him by Boeing.
And we now know Boeing had got their sums wrong by mistake. The flight simulator had been programmed for a much lower speed than the real plane was doing at the time of the crash.
We then, not too long after that, met with Niki Lauda in Vienna and tried to tell him in a nice way, number one, that we didn't think that this was based on valid data, and number two, that we could help him vindicate his crew.
So Niki Lauda tried again, this time at Boeing's headquarters in Seattle, this time using a simulator which had been properly programmed.
It was impossible to control. The airplane just turns over. You can't control it. Whatever delay you give the pilot to react to it, even immediate reaction, there was no way to control it, because very simply the airplane was stalling, in our case, the left wing, in that way that you just couldn't hold it, and that was the problem.
How many times did you try?
Well, I think I tried about 12, 15 times after we...
In the simulator, Niki Lauda crashed every time, as his crew did in real life on that one fatal occasion.
It was impossible.
And this was the accident Boeing and the American regulatory authority, the FAA, said couldn't happen. This so far unpublished accident report disagrees.
The aircraft was not capable of controlled flight.
Critics say other planes of the same type should have been grounded immediately or made safe, but no action was taken for 5 months.
Isn't it amazing that between June and September, at risk were literally thousands of people flying on a plane that was highly suspected of having it happen again. And they gamble with human life. But the FAA goes along with the gamble. And who are the chess pieces? The traveling public.
This keep them flying attitude was to become a common feature of our investigation in Seattle, Boeing's headquarters, and around the world. It happened after Thailand, and it happened after Kegworth. And it had happened, according to the Israeli airline El Al, with the jumbo jet which crashed at Amsterdam. A year earlier, there'd been a similar crash in Taiwan. In each case, says El Al, fuse pins connecting the engines to the wings were suspected of having failed, and both planes lost 2 engines.
Yes, El Al believes that the cause of the accident of the Amsterdam disaster was a metal fatigue of the mid-spar fuse pin, which connects the aircraft, the engine to the wing.
El Al, vigorous in the defense of its dead pilots, told us Boeing should now redesign the engine mountings and make new, stronger pins to secure the engine to the plane. But what should happen in the meantime to the ubiquitous jumbo jet?
This is difficult. The stakes are enormous. They're really the backbone of air commerce throughout the world. There's probably over 800 of them in service. And as a practical matter, you simply, it's not going to happen that they're going to take all these out of service all at once to fix a problem. What is going to happen, if history is any teacher, is that Boeing will work on some kind of fix that everybody can live with. That fix will be worked in gradually.
The keep them flying attitude was a problem after Kegworth too. Planes with the same fatal engine design flaw kept flying for 6 months after the British Midland Flight 092 took off from London to Belfast. The chairman of the US Senate Committee into Aviation Safety says the accident simply shouldn't have happened.
We live in a society that can send people safely back and forth to the moon. Don't you think we ought to be able to get them from London to Kegworth or someplace like that?
The plane was just 3 months old. It was fitted with a version of a proven GE Snecma engine, but one which had been uprated to make it produce more power.
My car was hemmed in with 30, 40 hearses with empty coffins on the side of the roadway, and that really did bring home the enormity of it to me.
Fan blades in the uprated engine couldn't cope with the extra load and flew apart. Donat Desmond was trapped for 2 hours in the wreckage alongside the body of his wife.
I am very angry about the fact that my plane had not been adequately tested. I was in with 126 other people in a plane, and it didn't go right, and 47 people were killed. It should never have happened. The plane should have been tested in the first place.
Indeed, the engine had not been fully tested in flight. As with the Lauda-Air reverse thrust mechanism, the manufacturers relied on computer calculations to prove it was safe, and they were wrong.
If you had the choice of having a fully tested engine or one that somebody punched some numbers in the computer, which one would you have?
I would say the fully tested engine, but I think in that case, it might have been that there has been the engine flying before millions of hours, and they just upgraded it, and they thought the data is available. They have available out of the test bench is enough, but I agree with you, it was not.
But it wasn't, and their own chief engineer, or General Electric's chief engineer, said 10 years before, the tests you are applying will not show up fan blade flutter, which is what broke the engine.
Possible, this is possible. I agree with you that there are certain areas we can push harder. Yes.
Stephen McCoy's family are pushing him as hard as they dare. He was the last Kegworth victim to leave hospital. He's now learning to communicate by computer. The engine designers relied heavily on computers, and that, according to a leading aerodynamicist, was just not good enough.
Well, what they should have done, and this is widely recognized, I'm sure, by the manufacturers as well as by other people, is they should have either tested it on an aircraft at the full range of conditions, or they should have tested it in a facility which simulated high altitude.
And in a report to the Kegworth survivors, Professor Cumstie went further. He described the test procedures as thoroughly unsatisfactory and pointed out the industry had reason to know they were unsafe as long ago as 1975. After the engine failed at Kegworth, the same type subsequently failed twice more, mercifully without disastrous results, and the uprated engine was downrated. The industry had admitted the engine was not safe. What, in your opinion, was the prime reason for the Kegworth air crash?
The engine blew up. If it hadn't have blown up, we wouldn't be in this situation. A 3-month-old engine blew up. Now, if that was your car and you just brought it out of the garage, you would be a little bit upset.
In Seattle, we wanted to ask Boeing, the world's biggest plane maker, what steps they'd taken to ask for a recall of the 737-400 after Kegworth, what action they'd taken after the jumbo jet accident in Taiwan, repeated in Amsterdam, And why had the 767 thrust reversers not been adequately tested in flight? Boeing declined, so we met their head of safety out for his morning constitutional.
Mr. Cosgrove, my name's Roger Cook from Central Television in Britain. I'd like to ask you about the safety of some of Boeing's aeroplanes.
I beg your pardon?
I'd like to ask you about the safety of some of Boeing's aeroplanes.
I don't think this is the proper place to talk about that.
Well, we've tried very hard to get Boeing to talk about 3 particular incidents. The Kegworth crash involving a 737-400, which had an engine failure, without which there would have been no crash. The Lauda-Air crash, when there was a reverse thrust failure in midair. And the currently disputed Amsterdam air crash.
I'm sorry. I don't think this is the proper place or time to talk about that. Thank you very much.
But we would like some answers. There are questions that should be answered. And Boeing's reply to us initially was, first of all, we can't talk about things because reports haven't been published, and then we can't talk about things because reports have been published. Pretty contradictory stuff, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I think you got the proper answer.
The proper...
It's awfully early in the morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning to be talking about this. I'm surprised you're not in bed. It's very early, you know.
Well, we're up early, just like you're up early.
Yes, and I think that you're invading my privacy also, if you don't mind.
This is a public road.
Fine.
You're perfectly satisfied, are you, that all these aeroplanes that are currently flying about of the types we're talking about have been made safe?
Yes, I am.
100% safe?
They're as safe as they're ever going to get with the knowledge that we have.
Well, that's not complete knowledge. So what you're saying is there will always be problems.
I have not said that. I said we have made them as safe as we know how to make them.
And are you happy to rely so heavily on computer design, which has led to faults which turned up in real life because testing wasn't adequate?
You know, you're wasting your time talking to me. This is the improper place to do this.
You're the proper man to talk to. You're the vice president in charge of safety.
Sir.
And we're trying to do our job.
Sir, would you mind just leaving me alone, please? Thank you.
A civilized conversation, but hardly illuminating. At Kegworth, GE Snecma had made the engine that failed, Boeing had made the plane, and the authorities had licensed it. The pilots just flew it, and though they did shut down the undamaged rather than the damaged engine, the symptoms, the smoke and the vibration, disappeared. The plane flew normally for 20 minutes before the damaged engine finally failed. But that part of the story has had little or no coverage.
Well, the industry are very used to dealing with accidents. The industry, it is such a huge multinational, multi-billion-dollar concerns of the regulators, the manufacturers, the designers. They can survive these kind of debacles. Usually you'll see time after time the 2 words popping up: pilot error, pilot error.
The Kegworth pilot, Kevin Hunt, was retired because of his disability. His co-pilot was sacked following the official accident report, altered, remember, between draft and final version.
In the draft report, we were considered to have dealt with the problem reasonably well, and the bulk of the blame lay with the industry, whereas in the final report, the blame was being totally put onto our shoulders, and the industry was being let off the hook.
And so it might appear. The draft report was sent to the interested parties for comment, and then an extra paragraph had been inserted on the final page.
The crew acted contrary to their training.
So who was it who asked for the conclusion of the report to be changed between draft and publication to point the finger more firmly at the pilots? Well, that's a question for Captain John Mimpress, Chief of Flight Operations, here at the Civil Aviation Authority.
Well, we made the comment, and it's up to the Accident Investigation Branch to decide whether they want to give it credit or not. They were at liberty to ignore our comment. They didn't.
Should this engine have been certified in the first place? After all, it was based on extrapolations from a known engine. It was people's projections, guesswork, if you like. And the fan blades failed because they reached the point of no return. The guesswork was wrong.
There's a tiny bit of hindsight knowledge in that. At the best of their ability, everyone thought that they had done the job correctly. As you rightly say, yes, the engine failed, but the engine failed within the tolerances in that the failure was containable, and what went wrong was that the crew shut down the wrong engine.
Well, critics might say, there you go again, siding with the industry. They also do say you were slow to react after Kegworth and the two similar incidents that followed it. So why didn't you ground the aircraft sooner to make sure they were safe?
Well, we had one failure on an engine. There are going to be occasions where engines fail, and at that time there was no indication that we were running into a trend. There was then nearly 6 months before there was a second and similar failure, and then a third one very rapidly after that. And that was the moment we grounded the aircraft. And we didn't ground it because the engine failure in itself was causing concern. We grounded it then because we were getting too many failures, and then there was the risk of 2 failures happening on the same flight, and that's unacceptable.
And so, in the industry's eyes, David McClelland is a guilty man. But critics say the CAA is too much part of the industry. One of McClelland's ex-colleagues at British Midland, a former Red Arrow to boot, resigned after Kegworth in protest at the way the incident was created and handled.
Behind any accident, be it aircraft, motor accident or whatever, there's always a series of events running up to the ultimate. And that series of events needs to be investigated, and every angle investigated to find out who else is to blame. And in the Kegworth disaster, there are other people to blame other than the pilot.
In America, the newly formed and powerful Senate Committee on Aircraft Safety says current overall standards aren't high enough. You'd argue that even the best pilots couldn't be expected to overcome a fundamental design fault.
That's right. That is exactly right. And that is one of the reasons why we are, here in the United States, going after this situation, and we have just started it within the past couple of months, and we will continue until it is finished to make sure that we don't have another Kegworth.
By a quirk of fate, on one of the flights that we undertook during the making of this program, I found myself sitting right next to Bert Williver, Boeing's Senior Vice President in charge of engineering and technology. A little convivial conversation, a little gentle questioning, and we had replies to some of the questions Boeing didn't want to answer. At Kegworth, he conceded that the prime cause of the crash was the failure of a defective engine. Dealing with the Lauder Air crash, he admitted the flight simulator had never been programmed to test the conditions the pilot actually met. And in Amsterdam, he said it was the airline's fault. They had not properly maintained the engine fuse pins, so Boeing were now making them idiot-proof. Another flight, another safe arrival, as indeed 99.99% of them are. But safety is still a concern. Interestingly, the Boeing executive I traveled next to looks forward to the day, he says, when planes are designed, tested, and flown by computer. At least then, they couldn't blame the pilot.